Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming out. My name is Christopher West. I'm the curator of paleobotany here at the museum. I'd like to welcome you to the final talk in our speaker series, which is sponsored by the Royal Tyrrell Museum Cooperating Society. So a big thank you to them for this and for all the other things they do. Today I have the pleasure to introduce Dr. Tammo Reichgelt. Tammo is a paleobotanist at the University of Connecticut in the United States. Tammo first pursued a bachelor's degree in earth sciences and then a master's degree from Utrecht University in the Netherlands, where he worked on Triassic environments in Arizona. He then went on to receive his PhD from the University of Otago in New Zealand, where he focused on reconstructing Miocene climate from plant fossils. Tammo later went on to do postdoctoral work at Columbia University in New York City, for finally obtaining his faculty position at the University of Connecticut. Tammo's ongoing research includes several international collaborative study projects that bring together research on Earth's functions during much warmer periods in Earth's history, providing the critical perspectives that fossil plants can offer to changing climates in the past and in the future. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Tammo Reichgelt to the stage to present his talk.
All right, yes, thank you everyone. Thank you for having me. Thank you for bringing me over. A little bit of a separate personal introduction here is that I was actually here at the Royal Tyrrell and then in Dinosaur Provincial Park when I was a teenager. And I remember roaming around and really excited, trying to find little fossils that were scattered everywhere. Couldn't find anything, probably because I couldn't identify them. So if you like, then you could think that my inability to find fossil vertebrates led me into paleobotany. And, it was a fun transition, I will say that. I don't know how many people here usually go to these paleobotany talks, but we can learn a lot from paleobotany. And especially as we do it, we don't, Christopher and I, pursue these projects. We're oftentimes not looking at taxonomy specifically, but more at what these plants can tell us about the environment and the ecology that other creatures were living in as well, most notably, of course, dinosaurs. Okay, so what we can learn from plant fossils, I think you're probably aware that the dinosaurs lived in a much warmer world than we do. And so in general, we try to use these kind of past ecosystems, past environmental analogies to tell us something about the future. And I'm going to focus on the future first today and then transition into the past because that is more of a far future analogy. So bear with me. Very basically, the outline that we're going to be looking at today is global greening, what it is, what am I actually talking about, modern day climatic change, and whether it is or it isn't driving us towards a future greening world, and then we'll turn to the Cretaceous and really see if we can find evidence of global greening there and what kind of mechanisms are involved in creating a greener world. All right, so first, let's put a little analogy here for global greening. What you're looking at over here is a map of the world with carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere during the year 2006. So this is produced by radar imagery from NASA, where they basically have a way to create backscatter that tells us where the highest carbon dioxide concentrations are in the world. You'll see here a scale going from 377 to 395. Now maybe you're aware of this already, but in 2006 that was around the average. Nowadays, I think we're already at something like 420, so we're way off this scale. But the reason why I'm showing this is because there will be a global greening happening that significantly reduces the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And you're probably familiar with it. If you're like me, then you're probably waiting around for it desperately all winter. The bursting of the leaves for spring, and then we'll also transition to the last stage, the desiccation stage, And all of this is related to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So I'll just play it out. Bear in mind that what you're looking at, very bare basics, is that if you see, if you actually see, the ground, the water, or the land masses, that means that carbon dioxide the concentrations are relatively low. And if it gets into the reds and the purples, then the carbon dioxide concentrations are relatively high. And so I'll do a little bit of narration while we go through this. Okay, so we're in January right now, January midst of winter. There's not yet much photosynthesis going on in the northern hemisphere, but there are some places where it is rather active. Over here, for example, the Amazon is a good example, where you see sort of this pulsing beat going on all the time, and that sort of happens on a daily cycle. That's just the Amazon bursting into life every morning, photosynthesizing, and then at night it quiets down again, and the plants start respiring carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. That's just sort of a daily beat. But in the meantime, you can see that we're transitioning into very early spring here, and carbon dioxide concentrations in the northern hemisphere here reach a kind of peak where it's very red, and that's because all this time plants have been sort of lying around, not photosynthesizing, mostly just decomposing. But right now there's a very drastic transition going to take place, which has to do with the large northern hemisphere forests, especially the boreal forests in Canada and Russia, bursting into life in spring. And we see sort of this vacuum cleaner effect where all of a sudden all this land starts to show up from underneath the carbon dioxide. And it just basically means that because the days are long, photosynthesis is more important at that time than respiration and decomposition. And on a global scale, because the land mass is so large in these areas, we see the big drawdown of carbon dioxide. In the meantime, the southern hemisphere is kind of, not doing much of anything. That has to do with the fact that there's just less land mass there, so less biomass to really influence the atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration. And as we transition into fall, we sort of start to see the reverse happening, where the plants photosynthesize less, respiration takes over, and the plants shut down for the season and start decomposing. The lowest global carbon dioxide concentrations every year are in the beginning of October. The highest are in the earliest spring, end of March, beginning of April. So now we can see that it starts to come back. So this is sort of global greening, but on a yearly scale. You can see that what we were looking at just now is that plants globally photosynthesize and causes this carbon dioxide to disappear, and globally that respiration and decomposition is what causes the carbon dioxide to reappear. And I'll note, just quickly for reference, that of course that flux in and out of the atmosphere every year vastly exceeds anything that we produce with the burning of fossil fuels. Now, the capacity of any place to produce or to photosynthesize is known as gross primary productivity. These are some words that you're going to be hearing a lot today. Basically, the amount of carbon per square meter per year that an area can absorb. But more importantly, what we're talking about today is net primary productivity, because that represents how much is stored as biomass. So meaning that you take photosynthesis and respiration both into the equation, and what are you left with? That is the amount of biomass that has been accumulating, that has accumulated that year. So that's the important one. That's the one that I want you to remember. And I want to not leave you in the dark with all these kind of descriptions and maps of the world. Let's just look at some examples of what that looks like, some that hopefully that will look familiar. That net primary productivity can vary from a negative number to all the way up to 2,000 grams of carbon per square meter per year. And these types of ecosystems that you're looking at over here, they're relatively sparsely vegetated, grasslands, boreal grasslands or deserts. They usually don't store that much carbon every year. But if we go a little bit higher, for example, towards savanna ecosystems that are a little bit more densely vegetated or have a few trees here and there, we get to moderately low productivity environments. This is maybe something that looks more familiar in this part of the world because it's a boreal forest. Relatively productive environment, but it's only doing so during a small part of the year, only during the height of summer. If we want to go even higher productivity environments, we need to really vastly increase the amount of leaf area that we have. So none of this shrubby and grassy areas. We're talking like full-on trees and forests, especially these temperate seasonal forests that have really large amount of overall leaf surface area, can really ramp up the net primary productivity. And then when we go into a place where photosynthesis is basically happening year-round, now we're talking about rainforests, and those are the highest productivity environments that we have in the world. Now, the reason why I'm bringing up these different types is because later we're going to be talking about how primary productivity is changing in the world, and also what it was like during the Cretaceous. We're going to try to answer the question, how do we go from, or in environments that might be low productivity today, can we see evidence for high productivity in the future, or perhaps in the Cretaceous? I want you to bear this in mind as we move through the talk. And in terms of what global greening then is, how does that fit in there? Well, it is an increase of the amount of productive space. And the simplest way to think about this is just that you have an area where you have less vegetation, and another area where you have more vegetation, usually forest, and then an area where you have the forest expanding. That could be thought of as greening. So very technically speaking, it's just an expansion of the terrestrial biosphere. More biomass, increased in photosynthetic area and activity, and just very simply put, an increase in the amount of space occupied by plants, whether that's two-dimensional or three-dimensional. And why should you care? I mean, as paleobotanists, we're often forced to tell you why you should care about us, and this is my general attempt at that we have to remember that plants are the most important primary producers. They sit at the very base of the food chain that we all rely on, not to mention the way that they're involved in these biogeochemical cycles, one of which we were just looking at, water, carbon, and probably also very importantly, oxygen. That's where that all comes from. And plants occupy just the vast majority of all biomass on the planet, meaning that just by sheer weight and abundance, sheer mass and abundance, plants exceed everything else. About 82% of all living things on the planet by mass are plants. We are not even really on this diagram very much because we are in this little box over here on the bottom right. So that is just that's all animals put together by size comparison or by sheer mass comparison. Of course, plants exceed us by a lot. So that is, and we very much rely on those plants to keep doing what they're doing. And a reduction in plant biomass can be really disruptive for these global biogeochemical cycles. They can be really disruptive for the global food chain. So we want to understand what happens when the global environment changes to a degree. So let's look a little bit about the theoretical or practical limitations to greening, like what keeps plants from growing in certain locations. There are the obvious ones, temperatures. If you get into a colder area, as I'm sure you're familiar, when you're going up a mountain, at some point you run out of trees. And that is a limitation to, that is the temperature basically being limiting to where trees can grow. So that is a limitation to greening. Similarly, water availability. Trees do need a lot of water, so they do tend to reduce in places where the water that falls from the atmosphere is below a critical value. And then sometimes in really dramatic situations, you get these oases in the middle of the desert where there is a spring around that can supply the water. So there's kind of like an abrupt, contrast in non-green areas and green areas. But of course, we can also think about disturbances. Oftentimes it's fire that restricts the expansion of the biosphere. And nowadays, of course, it's just physical human disturbance. But then there's this last one. Carbon dioxide itself so the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere itself is a limitation to plants, because we have to remember that carbon dioxide is essentially the food of plants. The way that works is that photosynthesis is the way that they obtain the sugars that they then burn at night using oxygen in order to get energy. So more carbon dioxide in that way means that you can basically do this process more. You can photosynthesize more. And that limitation is actually quite drastic. During the last glacial cycles that we had over the last million years or so, there was more of a problem for plants with carbon starvation than that there was too much carbon in the atmosphere. Nowadays, the trend of increased carbon in the atmosphere theoretically leading to more photosynthesis is known as carbon fertilization. But there's also a second way than this direct sort of food needed for photosynthesis pathway that carbon dioxide influences a plant's capability of functioning. And that has to do with the way that a plant obtains carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. I have an example over here. So this is what a leaf looks like on a microscopic level. Maybe you've seen this before, where you have these different mouth or eye type things. Those are things that are several microns across, are often quite small. But what the plant does is it opens them up, and then in goes the carbon dioxide. Now, that's all well and good, but problematically, evolution never really works in the most optimal fashion, because when it opens up its stomata, when it opens up those pores, water also comes out. And the plant is basically always probing the environment, trying to figure out, well, how often can I keep these stomata open in order to get enough carbon dioxide for photosynthesis while not losing too much water. So in a sense, if the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere increases, the plant can basically go like, oh, hey, I have enough food now. Now I don't have to lose that much water in order to keep myself active. So that is known as the increase in water use efficiency. That increased carbon dioxide basically makes plants less thirsty because they don't have to waste that much water in order to stay active. That's a little bit wonky, but just remember this, that if the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere goes up, theoretically, the plants become less thirsty. All right? Right. So, now with all that in mind, the way that we always think about carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is that it is increasing through, the combustion of fossil fuels and all that. And so theoretically, you would think that you would see the effects of these changes in the carbon dioxide in the modern day biosphere. So theoretically, how this increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere should lead to greening. And the three ways that I'll highlight over here is that the indirect pathway is increased carbon dioxide warms the planet up, so we should be able to see plants sort of growing in environments that otherwise would be too cold. That makes sense. The other one, of course, is that carbon fertilization would make more carbon available in the atmosphere for existing vegetation, so that should increase their growing rates. And the third one is that this water use efficiency should allow plants to move into places that would otherwise be too dry. So let's see how that pans out. I'm just going to give you the answer, not going to go too much into the details here, just so that you know what sort of this current, up-to-date scientific consensus is on these pathways. And I should add that every one of these topics obviously is a universe of its own, and I'm vastly oversimplifying here. But in general, we do see a temperature effect. So yes, we do see that plants are now capable of growing in warmer, in environments that used to be too cold. We have mixed results with carbon fertilization, that not all plants seem to be able to really take advantage of this, and we don't actually see much of an effect of water use efficiency. And mostly those mixed results and no are probably the result of that certain ways of photosynthesizing are just hardwired into the genetics of the plants, and that they don't really have the time to adapt to all this on evolutionary timescales. Basically, the changes are happening too fast for them to adapt. But some of these examples of where we see global greening, there are good examples of warmth-loving plants basically making their march northwards, such as palms on the North American East Coast. Palms are making their way northward. And I think even in Vancouver Island, you now get palms, certain types of palm trees, naturally reproducing inside the temperate rainforest there. So that's kind of cool, but also kind of worrisome, because obviously then you have a little bit of a problem with invasive species due to these warmer temperatures. We also see in places in the far north, forests taking over the tundra. So basically, trees that normally would be, would not last the winter, making their way into the tundra. Again, that same sort of significance. In theory, that seems good because you get an expansion of the biosphere. But we have to remember that's basically just sacrificing one ecosystem for another. Now, for carbon fertilization, the problem is that basically the plants that we don't want to see increasing their abundance are mostly taking advantage of this overabundance of carbon. And those are the smaller herbaceous plants that can adapt really quickly, that have a fast generational turnover. I call them the live fast, die young species. They are really benefited by all this extra carbon in the atmosphere, whereas a long-lived tree that probably was already, like the individual itself was already alive when the Industrial Revolution even started, they can't really adapt that quickly. They are more adapted for the long periods of time when there is not enough carbon in the atmosphere, and so they're more cautious. They're the slow and steady species. They don't seem to really increase their photosynthetic activity at all. And then the water use efficiency, the problem there is that you're balancing this increased capability of the plants become less thirsty, but then at the same time they have to deal with increased drought. And as it stands currently, drought seems to win over from water use efficiency. So these are sort of the general ways that we can see the effects of global greening in the modern day world, but we have to remember that all these changes are happening incredibly fast. So it's kind of hard to predict how this will play out in the long run. But the takeaways that I want you to have from this, as we are kind of halfway through the presentation now, is that basically changes are happening too fast, but that we don't see as much of this biosphere expansion. We don't see increased productivity as much as you would expect in theory. That trees are not as benefited as weeds are. And we have these other complicating factors that essentially boil down to that, it takes generations for plants to adapt to things, and these changes are happening too fast. So that doesn't look like, great news for the biosphere. It doesn't look like, for example, that this increased biosphere will, for example, make up for the amount of increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. But it does leave us with the question of what happens when, the biosphere does have time to adapt. And in that context, we can turn to, to past times when, under completely natural conditions, the carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere were a lot higher. And so that is where, our analogy to the Cretaceous comes in, because to a certain degree, you're already familiar with the global greening that we had in the Cretaceous, because you're familiar with these beautiful reconstructions of ecosystems in the Cretaceous where places that are currently too dry or too cold will have had these lush green ecosystems where several hadrosaurs are staring down a tyrannosaurid in a beautiful lush green landscape. And in general, Cretaceous, of course, a very long period of time, but in general, temperatures globally were 5 to 10 degrees Celsius warmer than today. If we're comparing that to modern day global warming, the amount of warming that has taken place is, I think, still limited to a degree Celsius, so way less than that. And the amount of warming that they're worried about happening is up to 3 to 4 degrees. So that's not even close to what the Cretaceous was like, or could have been like. So that's also known as a hothouse climate. And the way that we know that these climates were a lot warmer are through various, were a lot warmer and a lot greener, was of course through plant fossils. So here's some examples from Alberta itself, that we know that Alberta wasn't, covered in prairie or covered in badlands during the Cretaceous. We know that because of these types of plant fossils that we find up and down the province. And similarly, if we go to like the most harshest conditions that we can even think of, this is a reconstruction of what Antarctica used to look like in the Cretaceous. No ice at the North or South Pole. In fact, you have these very dense, lush ecosystems, at least in this reconstruction. And again, we know that because plant fossils from Antarctica tell us that, we had large leaves. Nowadays, the most complex thing that you could find in Antarctica is, moss-like things or angiosperms that look like moss. We have wood, meaning that you had large trees, and also pollen and spores from that area tell us that the diversity was also big. It wasn't just like a few straggling, sad-looking plants that could cling on for dear life. No, we had a thriving, diverse ecosystem here. And then the third example that I'll give you is reconstructions from places that are currently too dry. You're probably familiar with Spinosaurus over here, found all over, found in northern Africa, in a place that famously now is very dry, the Sahara Desert. And always being, it literally is thought now that it's an aquatic or semi-aquatic animal, and it's often reconstructed to, that its ecosystem that it lived in was kind of swampy, kind of boggy, lots of greenery around. And again, that comes from these types of fossils where we have broad-leaved angiosperms, so very large leaves indicating that it can't have been too dry, because if it got too dry, then those plants would shrivel up. And you see, again, diversity of pollen and spores. Importantly, spores, because ferns and mosses are not as good as hanging on to moisture as other plants, as more advanced angiosperms and conifers are. So their presence indicating that it was wetter there at the time. So we're going to look a little bit in more detail. That the world was greener, we already know. But what we're going to talk about is like what the mechanisms behind that were, why was it greener, and also how productive were these ecosystems? Like, what is their modern day analogy in terms of like how much of this carbon was being stored in biomass and how productive these forests were? And I want you to bear a couple of things in mind as we go through this. I mean, I'm preaching to the choir here probably with giving you explanations about the Cretaceous, but just as a reminder, this is what the world would have looked like during the Cretaceous or parts of the Cretaceous. It's, of course, an enormous amount of time, 79.5 million years. I teach undergraduate classes also on dinosaurs, and the first thing that I always hit my students with is that I want you to realize that the Cretaceous period was longer than the time since the Cretaceous period. So that, the animals that were living in the early Cretaceous were further away in time from a T-Rex than we are from a T-Rex. That usually gets a little bit of oohs and ahs, but I don't expect you to be surprised by this necessarily. But another couple of key things, of course, is that the continents in general very scattered. Sea level is high. This means that a source of moisture is not necessarily too far away. Like in the modern day and also in the times of Pangea, you kind of are far away from any oceans, which means that it's much easier to develop deserts. So bear that sort of thing in mind as we go through this. I know this is my first very complicated graph, but it's also to give you sort of a global picture of what happened since the Cretaceous. We have this is a timeline over here. It's also, this diagram over here is probably the Bible of paleoclimatologists. But we have over here on the left is the Cretaceous just hanging on at 66 million years ago. And this timeline basically tells us what has happened since then. And since the Cretaceous, we have a little bit of a spur in global temperatures into a hothouse climate. But ever since then, we basically just cooled and cooled and cooled until the modern day ice house, where we're sort of varying between massive glaciers, covering all of Canada, and slightly less glaciers, slightly fewer glaciers. And all the while, the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere kind of drops alongside the temperature. Now, I should add that the carbon dioxide is what people can agree upon much less than the temperatures, but in general, it seems to follow the same pattern of decreasing carbon dioxide levels as we move into our modern day ice house. So what does that mean? Is that we're basically sort of having a general global ungreening ever since the Eocene. That since the Cretaceous, we kind of exchanged these types of ecosystems for either grassland in places that were too, were warm enough but too dry, and ice in places that were, too dry and too cold. So we know that since the Cretaceous, a massive ungreening of the world has gone on, but we really want to know why, what mechanisms are responsible for this, and also how productive these ecosystems can get in the Cretaceous. So we'll look at some temperature effects, the effects of cloud formation and rainfall, and look if we can actually parse apart something as difficult to define and identify as carbon fertilization and water use efficiency. And for this, we have to turn to the field. We have to go out and collect some fossils. Here you can see Christopher and I working out in the field collecting fossils. And I'll give you some very oversimplified ways that we actually can reconstruct productivity from these ancient leaves. And I'll tell you this, I gathered up a bunch of already published materials from several places around the world, in addition to our own work, that basically this is the coverage. Right now, I'm still working on expanding this data set, but this is the Cretaceous world during the Campanian, and the data points come from all over the Cretaceous, so not just the Campanian, but this is just to simplify the view for a second. And we have a lot of data points from the Russian Arctic, a couple of them in Alaska, and then at lower latitudes we find, plant fossils in various places in New Mexico, one here in Newfoundland, and then in the southern hemisphere you get New Zealand and Australia, and one from India. New Zealand, I have to remind you, at that time was very close to the South Pole, so that is sort of our analogy to the Northern Hemisphere polar regions. And what we can do with these macro leaf fossils is that essentially the leaf form, especially their size, is directly correlated to how productive they can get. So these graphs over here, they show you length and length to width squared, that all of them of a leaf correlate to net primary productivity. So basically meaning that if we find these types of beautiful leaf fossils and we can measure their size, that we can find, then we can correlate them to modern day ecosystem level net primary productivity. So this gives us a way of saying how productive these ecosystems are. And because it's so intimately tied to the amount of moisture that is available to these plants, it can also tell us something about the amount of rainfall in that environment. And if they're higher than their modern day counterparts, if the amount of carbon that they store away is higher than their modern day counterparts, it also tells us something about carbon fertilization. Now that's relatively straightforward. Essentially, leaf size tells you something about productivity. This one is a little bit more complicated. I think most people probably wouldn't look very much at a fossil that looks like that. This is from my own lab. It's just a couple of leaves of a conifer over here on a shoot. It's very dark because it has been it has been stuck in coal for a very long time. But some of these things, when you clear them and you treat them with chemicals, then you can actually get a beautiful cleared microscopic leaf section like I did over here. And those types of fossils are pretty rare, but their advantage is that they are organically preserved. They both have we have both the capacity to then look at their microanatomy and also at their leaf chemistry. And that's important because these two things together can tell you about how quickly the plant was digesting, how active the plant was, how quickly was it metabolizing. It tells us something about the thing that the plant was in direct contact with while it was living, which is the atmosphere. So it tells us something about atmospheric chemistry. And basically, the microscopic anatomy like this can also tell us something about what the plant was, what its calculus was in terms of gas exchange. If you remember, whether they want to optimize the amount of carbon they put in or whether they want to kind of restrict the amount of water that comes out. So these types of things are rare, but they are really cool when you do find them. And I found a couple of good examples from around the world. So let's just dive straight into some of these results. No idea how I'm doing on time, but we're good? Okay. 20 minutes, okay. So let's just first answer the easiest question. Does temperature play a role in Cretaceous greening? The things that I want you to remember over here is what we're talking about in the future, or the present and the future, is that we do see the effects of global greening as a result of temperature changes. And so the question now is, do we see that in the Cretaceous as well? And the answer, well, as you probably can intuitively tell, because we do have those forests, or we do have a lot of leaf fossils at the high northern latitudes, that should be true. But just exactly how true that is not exactly known. Now, for reference, over here is net primary productivity by different biome types. So, for example, deserts are not very productive. Here you have boreal forests. There you have temperate seasonal forests, like you might find in the eastern United States today. And then tropical rainforest and temperate rainforest kind of similar to each other. So let's just see where our Arctic forests and our Antarctic forests fall out. Right over here, from the Cretaceous Arctic forests, they're very, very similar to modern day temperate seasonal forests. So meaning a deciduous woodland like you would find them today in the eastern United States. That's our best modern day analogy in terms of net primary productivity. But what really blows the productivity out of the water are these Antarctic forests over here that are just incredibly high, comparable to modern day rainforests, meaning that in the southern hemisphere at that time, on the relatively large amount of continental landmass available in the southern hemisphere, you have these very productive, rainforest environments. You can also have to remember that this is not, we're not talking about, that they, like in modern day rainforests, that they were photosynthetically active all the time, because they literally couldn't, because these places would have seen permanent darkness during the winter, and of course photosynthesis just simply shuts down. And so instead we have this incredible amount of productivity, probably mostly in the summer when just the amount of daylight available was enormous. You kind of imagine what that tells us about the ecosystems at the time, where some of our most productive environments would have been at the South and North Pole, and really only just seasonally, Imagine, for example, that in modern day you have a lot of birds migrating to more productive areas in the summer. Like, what would have been migrating to these incredibly productive Arctic and Antarctic forests in the Cretaceous? Just to kind of try and make it relevant for people who enjoy looking at animals. Okay, so takeaway: Cretaceous Arctic forest had a net primary productivity that's similar to modern temperate seasonal forest, and the Cretaceous Antarctic forest likely had net primary productivity similar to modern rainforests. So takeaway: very productive, much higher than we would expect, even like under these globally warmer scenarios. And if you remember nothing from this day, then just remember that while we have this at the Antarctic and Arctic today, in the Cretaceous you would have had this type of forest, and then in the Arctic and in the Antarctic you would have that type of forests. Okay, now let's look at these other examples. Can we see a role of precipitation in Cretaceous greening? Well, for that we would have to turn to these more lower latitude places. So, for example, New Mexico, or even over here in Alberta, where I currently do not have a data point, but I hopefully will in the future. And here's some Cretaceous floras that have been found in the steppes of Kazakhstan. And in general, this is a little bit harder to parse apart because there are already ecosystems there, right? Like, there are already seasonally productive ecosystems there. We can tell that over here, that bar graph is telling us there's quite a range of productivity. They sort of fall in the middle of these Cretaceous Arctic forests and these Cretaceous Antarctic forests, and they seem kind of similar maybe to rainforests plus or minus seasonal forests. There's kind of a range as you would expect with global climate variability. And the one data point that we have from the tropics, which is over here in India, suggests that we have a very productive forest there, not out of line necessarily, or not like completely unanalogous with modern day ecosystems, but quite high, even for modern day tropical rainforests. So the detailed look here that we should do then is look at the ecosystems that are there on the ground today and see how they compare to these Cretaceous ones. And the answer to that is that in most of those places you would find low to moderately low primary productivity ecosystems that are getting replaced by these much more productive ecosystems. So the bottom line being that, as this is very sparse data as yet, but we're working on expanding it, that from the Cretaceous to today we do see that there's a general trend that the Cretaceous floras would have been a lot more productive than they are today. And now we get to the last part and the most kind of conceptually complicated parts, which is that carbon fertilization process and the changes in water use efficiency. Now, I'll give you the answer right now that both of these questions, do we see evidence for increased carbon fertilization in the Cretaceous? Yes, And also we do see increases in water use efficiency, yes. But let me expand on that a little bit more. I just want you to remember that what we're talking about over here are these measurements that we can make from leaf chemistry and leaf microanatomy. So the data points, again, are kind of rare and sparse. Also, unlike these results, we mostly get these results on the leaf level from conifers rather than flowering plants. Also, I want you to remember that we don't see that increased carbon fertilization in the modern day, remember? We also don't see an increase in water use efficiency in the modern day. We mostly see that long-lived trees, such as conifers, that they don't really have the capacity to adapt quickly enough to make use of this increased amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So let's look exactly at how that pans out in the Cretaceous, where they had time to adapt to these sort of new environments. And, well, the answer is carbon fertilization looks pretty good already. We have a couple of comparison groups. I compared them to just flowering plants put together. Cypresses, things like junipers, pines, you're probably familiar with those, spruces, pines, firs. And then, of course, plum pines are a little bit less familiar here because they are mostly southern hemisphere distribution, but you have one over here in your greenhouses if you want to see what that looks like later on. And then, of course, the Taxaceae, the yews for comparison. And their leaf level photosynthetic rates, especially for angiosperms, is quite high. It's all over the place. Because angiosperms occupy such different niches, they kind of have at the bottom end, you would have the slow and steady wins the race types, and here towards the top, the really fast photosynthesizers are the ones that are more weedy, that can make quick use of all that increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. But by and large, modern day conifers like cypresses, pines, plum pines, and yews, they are not that photosynthetically active. They have a much lower photosynthetic rate. Whereas in the Cretaceous, those same conifers, they are much quicker. They're on par with modern day angiosperms, meaning that that increased amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere really allows them to assimilate carbon dioxide a lot faster. Their photosynthetic rate would have been much more rapid. They probably grew faster, and they were capable of increasing their biomass much quicker. Then, with water use efficiency, it's completely out of this world. We have to remember that the water use efficiency is probably the biggest problem for modern day plants. And in the Cretaceous, instead, what we see is that these really inefficient angiosperms, they're pretty, low. They don't have much. They're not very efficient with their water use. Conifers tend to be a bit better. They tend to be better at conserving water and instead opting for slow growth rates. But in the Cretaceous, it seems like they didn't really have to make that equation at all. They can keep a fast assimilation rate up. They can be very photosynthetically active while also being incredibly efficient with their water. What this basically means is that these plants, they wouldn't have experienced drought conditions all that much because they were so water use efficient. It basically means that we have kind of should think of this as a changing, a physiological change that would allow plants to grow into much drier areas simply because they were capable of handling the drought better. So that is one of the biggest surprises to me as well when I was analyzing this data. I'm still looking to expand this data set a lot more, but it's kind of out of this world, literally. And what that leaves us with is this implication that the habitats that the dinosaurs lived in, they were highly productive. They were stretching from pole to pole. Since, of course, plants are at the base of the food chain, this also implies something about what kind of biosphere those plants were capable of supporting. We have to remember that the biomass in animals is directly correlated to the biomass that is available in plants. So basically, there would have been more food around for herbivores and probably more habitat that could support those herbivores. We even have some evidence that carbon fertilization, conceptually this works. It's just hard to find, empirical data for this, but that the food that the herbivores eat probably had a higher caloric density, meaning that you obtain more energy from your food when carbon dioxide concentrations are high. So, what do I want you to walk away from in this presentation? That while global greening in the near future is not anything that is going to pan out in the way that we would like, mostly because long-lived species don't adapt that quickly, but weedy species do. Water availability also being an important limiting factor. And then in the Cretaceous, so on the really, really long timescales, we see that most of the greening takes place at the poles, where we have these incredibly productive ecosystems that would have rivaled modern-day rainforests. And then on the leaf level, even see these greening effects like precipitation, carbon fertilization, and increased water use efficiency. And the latter one being a very, very underappreciated and understudied role in global greening. So with that, I'll just point out that this is never a solo effort, working together with lovely people, including your in-resident paleobotanist. We have shared some good times in the field, and a lot of other people, some of whom might seem familiar. And with that, I'll say thank you for the invitation, and I hope that you learned something about fossil plants today.